Welcome to What I've Learned, the podcast which talks to child protection practitioners in development and humanitarian settings about community-led approaches. If you're a practitioner who's trying to find ways to strengthen community ownership of child protection, or perhaps you're just interested in learning more, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Lucy Hillier. I'm a child protection advisor living in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I focus on participatory and community-led approaches for child protection. As part of this, I run an initiative called the Community Child Protection Exchange, which develops innovative ways to help practitioners build their skills as facilitators of a community-led approach. Each episode, I talk with an expert from the child protection world, and we hear about their unique experience of community-led child protection and what they've learned along the way. We talk to academics and researchers, program advisors and field staff from all over the globe and discuss real-life examples of how different communities have led their own child protection. In this episode, I speak to Professor Mike Wessells, Professor Emeritus at Columbia University and a long-time champion of community and people-led approaches for child protection and MHPSS. Mike and I discuss an example of deeply participatory work undertaken with war-affected young mothers in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and northern Uganda. By talking us through the mindset and approach used to work with these young mothers, Mike shows us how giving space to the mothers to decide for themselves what outcome was best for them enabled what they and the community considered to be a successful reintegration process. Additionally, through this example, Mike also highlights how peacebuilding and social cohesion are inextricable elements of community or people-led actions for the well-being of children and communities.
It's arguably only when the collective as a whole is attuned to the situation, the plight of children, and to wanting to ensure the well-being of all its children, that there can be well-being with social cohesion.
Today, I'm talking with Professor Mike Wessells, who's a long-time child protection and psychosocial practitioner and researcher. He is Professor Emeritus at Columbia University at the Program on Forced Migration and Health. Mike has conducted extensive research on the holistic impacts of war and political violence on children, as well as interagency, multi-country participatory action research on community-led child protection. He regularly advises UN agencies, governments, and donors on issues of child protection and psychosocial support, including in communities and schools. So with that, Mike, I'm really happy to welcome you to the podcast today.
Thanks so much, Lucy. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk with you.
Thanks, Mike. So I think maybe before we get down to the real kind of technical nitty-gritty of the subject today, I wanted to just ask you a bit about yourself. I mean, we've known each other for about 10 years, I worked out, so time's gone pretty fast. And for all that time, we've worked on community-led child protection. So maybe you could just give us an idea of what your personal journey, how did you get to this point of really working in such a strong sort of way with a strong focus on grassroots, people-led development, humanitarian work? I was wondering, maybe, was there a significant moment where suddenly you thought this is the way we must work, or was this more of a gradual process of learning and reflection?
Thanks, Lucy. It's a big question. Well, I have a long history of peace activism, and I was very much part of the protest against the Vietnam War. As you know, in the U.S., that was very much a grassroots level of approach. And I think that had something to do with my interest in community level activism and instilled quite a bit of faith in what ordinary community people can do. When I began working in the international humanitarian and development arenas, I had the honor of working with Child Fund. Originally, it was a Christian Children's Fund. And I remember a really formative experience for me was during the 40 years plus Angolan War. And I had some Angolan colleagues led by Carlinda Monteiro, who had been trained to work on issues of trauma, which were, of course, important and serious. Carlinda was very good at listening to and empathizing with young people. And there was a situation in which a rural village had been bombed by government forces, and a lot of people had been killed. And there was a young girl, 10 years old, whose home had been bombed, and she had seen lots of dead people, and she ran away. Carlinda never asked aggressive questions that would pick people open and leave them more vulnerable. But this girl wanted to speak, and the girl said, well, the worst thing for me was that the government forces came and they bombed and they killed my parents. And I had to run away before we could do the burial rituals, the obito. And Carlinda then asked, why is that so important to you? And the girl said, well, where I live, we believe that if the dead do not receive the appropriate burial, the spirits of the dead cannot transition to the realm of the ancestors, and they're very upset, and they can cause problems in like causing illness or death or crop failure. So this was something that was very cultural. It didn't really fit with the trauma idiom that Carlinda and the Angolan team had been trained in. And so Carlinda began asking what then would help. And the girl said, well, if we could find a traditional healer who could do the obito, the burial rituals, and it involves slaughtering and sacrificing a goat to honor the ancestors, that would be a great help. And so Carlinda did that and worked with the girl and others in the community to have a traditional burial ceremony. And this, for me, really indicated the extent to which outside experts have relevant expertise, but may not know some of the things that cause the greatest psychosocial distress. Trauma was an issue, but in this case, loss was a bigger issue. And the means of addressing the stresses associated with the loss were cultural rituals and cultural practices that outside psychologists like myself, would never have thought of in a million years. So it was a real wake-up call that we need to blend the external knowledge from outside experts with insider knowledge, cultural knowledge, and then do it in ways that would create a more culturally grounded and holistic approach, and that we should begin viewing communities not as sites, not as beneficiaries and sites for rebuilding, but as resources, as human beings and collectives who have resources, resilience, cultural practices, and ideas for how to achieve healing and moving forward under difficult circumstances. So it's not to say that, this led me totally to a community-led perspective, but it was a really important moment. And then a second one was in 2008, when a group of agencies, Save the Children, World Vision, Child Fund, a whole set of us, were working on community-led child protection mechanisms and child protection committees that had been set up mostly by outside experts. And these committees were designed to monitor and respond to violations of children's rights. And they were a good thing, but they met with a whole variety of challenges and had some significant limitations. And so we agreed as a group that maybe we should conduct some co-learning, looking across our respective agencies and look at the strengths and limitations of these things and ask, how effective are they? What determines their effectiveness? Are there better ways of doing things? So we did that. And I had the honor of leading the technical research, and it was with a team of very talented people. And basically what we learned is that they have moderate levels of effectiveness at best, and oftentimes they had low levels of effectiveness. When they were effective, we identified 7 key effectiveness factors, and the most important one of those was community ownership. When communities themselves organized around an issue that they cared about, and they took ownership and responsibility for that particular issue or issues, they then engaged in community-led action that they viewed as their own. Outside agencies could help them, but it was more in a facilitative kind of role. And what we found was that when that level of ownership was present, there were higher levels of effectiveness, and the effects and the community-led actions tended to be sustainable. Whereas when there were low levels of ownership, and there were these things were viewed more as NGO-led projects, when the external funding ended, typically the child protection committees collapsed, as did the positive outcomes for children. That's not entirely a negative thing. I mean, one can make the case that there are urgent moments in which outside projects can be really valuable in helping to protect children. I believe that and have done that for quite a number of years myself. But what we're seeing today is protracted armed conflicts. The average length of an armed conflict today is over 17 years. There's a blurring of the lines between humanitarian and development settings. So we now talk about the nexus, that looks longer term. And we have the Sustainable Development Goals that challenge us to think about sustainability. So for all these reasons, I've taken a turn to working with community-led processes. And I would say that it's a journey on which communities have consistently inspired me with regard to what they can accomplish. So it has kind of turned the tables on me from being the expert to now I feel a bit more of the student and the co-learner who walks alongside communities and values and honors what they teach me.
Thanks, Mike. Wow. Okay, so that's a lot to process. I think for anyone listening, your discussion around the interagency work, you gave a very good sort of potted summary of what community-led child protection is all about, the idea of community ownership. And I think what I liked about your Angola example is maybe just sort of weave the two stories together, is this idea that you, as experts, we have become aware that maybe we make an assumption about what is good for a child or what something means for a community and what might be good for them. And maybe that is misdirected because we don't understand the cultural context. And I liked the story that you tell about the war in Angola, how the person working there didn't make an assumption about what was important for that girl, and that they took the time to listen to her. And I think that theme, that idea, that approach comes out a lot in all of your work. And hopefully, I know a lot of the things we're going to talk about today on this podcast. So thanks, Mike, for that. So maybe we should kind of drill down now into our focus. So you said that you'd like to talk today about how peacebuilding and community-led child protection, how they intersect and how they're related. And I thought maybe for myself, as well as the listeners, it might be really good to just start by maybe unpacking what we mean by peacebuilding in this community context. Like, how do you understand it? And maybe you could just sort of explain that a bit to start with.
Sure. Thank you, Lucy. By peacebuilding, I mean the set of processes that seek to end violence at all social levels and to build positive human relationships at political, community, family, societal, regional, international levels. And to do that, you have to not only cease the violence, you have to end the structural violence and the drivers of violence, the discrimination, inequities, the humiliations, the mistreatment of one group at the hands of another group. And so this is a very big task. It's a transformational task. Oftentimes in zones of armed conflict, there's talk about post-conflict reconstruction for peace, which is fine, but you have to be careful. Reconstruction doesn't mean moving society back to where it was, not that one could do that anyway, but arguably the condition of society before the armed conflict actually contained the seeds of the armed conflict. And so it's better to think about conflict transformation and to talk about this as a social change process. And it's interesting to me that peacebuilding is viewed in the humanitarian and development world as a separate sector from child protection and from mental health and psychosocial support for that matter. But, communities don't abide by these divisions. They think in much more holistic terms. So for me, a couple of really obvious connections are, first of all, child protection is very much about ending violence against children. And so, to the extent that one is going to build peace, you have to begin building violence at community level, family level, peer levels, individual levels. So for me, that's a very strong connection. And then coming the other way, peace building is very much about building social cohesion. And I don't think that you can end violence against children if you've got a situation in which children are systematically marginalized and discriminated against. That's a lack of social cohesion. And in community-led work, one of the most consistent findings from work that spans Sierra Leone, Kenya, India, and other countries is that a whole community approach that brings people together, in which people begin to ask, what are we as a community, including people who've been historically marginalized, going to do to support children? That is a process of building social cohesion, often by looking at the plight of children and their needs and recognizing that children are resources for the future, and then asking what can we as a community do to help them. So maybe let me talk about an important task of peace building, which is helping to integrate or reintegrate children and young people who had formerly been recruited into armed forces and armed groups, which is hugely important, whether you're talking about conflicts in Syria, South Sudan, or any of the many conflicts throughout the world. And oftentimes what happens is young people are recruited through a mix of push and pull factors into an armed group that then attacks the villages that they had been part of. And at the end of the conflict, villages view those people with fear, and they may not want to accept them back. And so part of peace building is standing down armies and helping people who had been part of armed groups enter civilian life. It's a very complex and a very contextual process. But I was very honored to be part of participatory action research that focused on the reintegration of girl mothers in 3 countries, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and northern Uganda, in the time period 2006 to 2011. And this action research was led by Susan McKay and also by Angela Veal, Miranda Worthen, and myself to some extent. And the really interesting thing was that in each of these countries, we were dealing with post-conflict settings. Sierra Leone, for example, had been about 4 or 5 years post-conflict. So one would have thought that the reintegration process would have been complete. but it's often not complete, particularly for girls, because a lot of these reintegration processes have discriminated themselves against girls. Sierra Leone was a good example. In Sierra Leone, it wasn't supposed to be this way, but locally, a lot of the reintegration programs required that you turn in an automatic weapon, an AK-47, and demonstrate that you knew how to disassemble it, strip it down, and reassemble it. So in other words, if you were a fighter, you would know how to do it, and then you could enter the program. Well, the problem with that is that lots of children who've been associated with armed forces and armed groups were not fighters per se. They were oftentimes, quote, soldiers' wives, cooks, porters, spies. There were lots of multiple roles, including mothers, because many girls became pregnant and became moms, while they were with the armed group. And they had children, and their children were often viewed by ordinary village people as really stained in some ways. They were viewed as rebel children and children born out of wedlock. And so they kind of had a double stigma, which were barriers. And the girls themselves were badly stigmatized. So in this work, that on reintegrating the former girl soldiers, we partnered with 11 different agencies, such as Save the Children and Caritas. And each agency worked in 2 sites, and each site had a facilitator from the agency who worked with a group of about 20 to 25 girl mothers, most of whom had been formerly recruited. The process was designed to also include some girls who were vulnerable, but who had not been recruited, and that was done to help reduce their stigma. However, it turned out that in practice, lots of girls had hidden the fact they had been recruited, and over time it came out that some of the more vulnerable girls themselves had also been recruited. But when we talked with them in the beginning, the girls said that their single biggest problem was stigma. They sat on the perimeter of their communities. People viewed them as animals and treated them like dogs. These were the girls' descriptions. They said, we can't go to community meetings. We're not viewed as acceptable human beings. People don't talk to us. We don't engage in education. If we try to sell things, people don't buy from us. And most of the girls, by their own description, survived by means of survival sex work. And they wanted to end this. And they wanted more than anything else to be good moms. They wanted to be able to pay for their children's health care. This was difficult because some of the girl mothers were HIV positive, and in some cases the HIV had been transmitted to their children. They lacked money, they lacked education, and some of them had behavior problems. It was no secret that in countries like Sierra Leone, girls and boys who had been recruited were oftentimes fed drugs as a means of making them fearless. And some girls had even been commanders. And so it was really quite difficult when you think about the process of reintegration. The usual reintegration process is driven by experts. And I've been part of that, and I'm not opposed to it. But one of its big limits is it doesn't address the real-life needs of the girls and the girl mothers themselves. And in this case, because so little was known about girls' reintegration, we thought a better place to start would be not with our ideas about reintegration, but with those of the girl mothers themselves. So the girl mothers formed groups of 20 to 25, and they began discussions. And the ground rules were that they could talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. And the facilitators had were privy to some of the discussions, and other things were private amongst the girls themselves. But it was very interesting. The girls chose not to talk about the war and its effects. Most of them wanted to focus on what are our lives like now, and what are the problems that we face, and what can we do together to make things better. So over a process of about 6 months, the girls began describing their problems, which I've said were economic, lack of livelihoods, lack of respect, and inability to mingle with other people. They being social outcasts was extremely painful for them, and they knew that that loneliness and exclusion fell heavily on the shoulders of their children. They wanted their children to be educated. They themselves wanted an education. And so they began a process of thinking through how they could help each other. And by the girls' own description, those discussions were hugely helpful in enabling them to understand that they weren't alone, feeling connected with others, and feeling a sense of voice and power within their own group. And so over time, we made known to them that there was a small amount of funding available, very small funding of several $1,000s that could be available for group work. That could be in the form of microcredit or a small loan, that it could enable the girls to do a group project or even to do individual projects that would improve their livelihoods. And this was what they had identified as a means of helping them to become good mothers. So they received some business training, learned how to save and keep track of money, and so on. And then many of them designed their own small business and livelihood initiatives. So, for example, some groups raised animals and then sold the animals off. Some groups in rural areas, such as Freetown, Sierra Leone, became hair designers, hair cutters, and designers. And they were very proud of the fact that they had cleaned themselves up, and they became very effective hair cutters, sought after for their services. Others did things like baking bread, baking and selling bread. In the urban areas of Monrovia, Liberia, girls decided to make and sell soap, which had been in short supply. And as they went, they decided to give some of the soap away to people who were unable to pay. And that had an impact, as one can imagine. As the girls did these business activities, they worked with self-selected community members who were community advisors. And those advisors were people whom the girls trusted and people whom they thought could help influence the community and help them understand that the girls, first of all, are human beings. They're not just bad seed or girls who had turned bad and had attacked the village. And the advisors advised the girls on proper behavior, gave them some moral tutelage on what it meant to be a good citizen, and they helped to mediate conflicts when conflicts arose. And crucially, the community advisors modeled acceptance of the girls and helped other members of the community realize that these are good young mothers, valuable members of our community, and people who want to take care of their children, and people from whom you can buy. And so this really helped reduce the stigma and gain the acceptance. So over time, over the next couple of years, the girls implemented their livelihoods project. And as they did, people began seeing them as serious, as caring for their children, as people who were valuable community members. And at the end of a couple of years, we did an evaluation that involved a mixture of qualitative and qualitative methods. And the quantitative survey was actually based on categories that had been identified in discussion with the girl mothers themselves and related to what they felt was most important to reintegration, like being a good mother, being able to go to community meetings and participate in those meetings, staying away from violence, and those kinds of things. And what we found was that there was a sharp increase in community acceptance for the girl mothers. This was very, very big. The backbone of reintegration is community acceptance. When communities recognize former child soldiers as human beings and as people who have value for the community, they take them back in. And that reduced stigma then opens the door for effective livelihoods, participation in education, and it removes the biggest psychosocial source of distress, that profound social exclusion. And so, this is a really big turning point. And this was a big turning point in terms of child protection. When the girls were excluded, they had to do sex work, sexual exploitation, sexual violence were quite normative. That changed as a result of this stigma reduction and social acceptance. And from a peacebuilding standpoint, the tensions between community people and the girls themselves was sharply reduced. We found that the girls' children enjoyed improved health because the girl mothers were able to pay for health care. And the girls' children were able to play with neighbors, and they were able to achieve an education. And I'm happy to say that some of the girl mothers themselves achieved an education. So this is one example of a process that integrated peacebuilding, child protection, and psychosocial well-being. And it's one that transformed, in which the girls transformed their identity from being soldiers to that of being civilians and moms. It transformed community relations because they moved from a sense of fear and deep division towards social cohesion. So all of these processes work together. On the community side, well-being and psychosocial distress were changed by this process. When the communities feared the girls, they were worried that the girls were somehow going to come and attack them or even slit their throats at night. This is what they had learned during the war. And that changed over time. And that reduction in fear is a very crucial step for mental health and well-being. So this is one real-life example of how these work together. And I think it made a huge difference in the lives of the girls and the community people.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I mean, that's a very powerful example of a project where a number of different aspects were addressed, really, because I was thinking, yes, in the beginning, you described this very long, kind of slow process of discussion where the girls are able to talk about whatever they want. It's not just about them reflecting and learning, co-learning about what is important to them, but also it's kind of a kind of therapy because they're getting to talk to each other, share experiences, bond, and start to work through some of the things that are important to them. And actually, I thought it's also perhaps this even is something which this project has gone into a kind of education sector as well, because you mentioned that a lot of them really wanted to get an education and they wanted their children to get educations, but they were excluded. And that kind of almost shows there's this intersection between child protection and psychosocial support and peace building, and one of the outcomes was education as well. So that's a very powerful story. But it made me think to do something that way, really takes a lot of skill from the organizations and the people involved in the organizations who are part of that. And I thought maybe could you unpack a little bit for us the kinds of people you mentioned, these kind of advisors that the girls chose and who kind of mediated for them at times and also acted a little bit like role models. Who were the people who worked on this particular project and how were they chosen? And what kinds of skills did you look for in somebody who might be part of a project like that?
The main people were facilitators. As I mentioned, each agency had one of its best facilitators working with the girl mothers. And the ground rule was that everything was centered around the power and the agency and the ownership by the girls and by the community. And the motto became, if it didn't come from the girls, it's not on track. It's not participatory action research. So in the beginning, we selected facilitators who were really interested in this girl and community-led process, who understood that they were going to be facilitators who stayed in the background, created space for girls and communities to hold the power. And we emphasized that their role was not to be directive. It all sounded great. They were really good people, women and men. But when they tried their hand in some of the trainings we did, they reverted very quickly to old habits of facilitation, which were highly directive. Oftentimes, as a joke, some of us talk about facipulation. It's a cross mixture between facilitation and manipulation. It's like, yeah, you facilitate and invite people to talk, but you're leading them where you want them to go. And that is not a community-led process. So what we did was we engaged in a process of initial training where there were lots and lots of role plays. And the role plays emphasized empathy, flexibility, bringing in people, not pressing people, learning to understand conflict, learning to understand your own inclinations to want to move things in a particular way, and learning how to keep that in the background, so that the emphasis instead is on the girl mothers and what they want to do. And this was very, very new. It took a lot of hard work on the part of the facilitators to learn it. They had to practice over and over again. And of course, no one-off training ever really succeeds. So on an ongoing basis, there was a backstopping that was provided by different people who would touch base with the facilitators. And then every once in a while, we would have a workshop that would bring together the girl mothers and the facilitators to try to make sure that the process was on track, that is, led by the girls and by the community people. With regard to the community advisors, the rule was that if it didn't come from the girls, it wasn't on track. So the girls themselves chose community advisors. But we did have discussions with them via the facilitators around what would a good community advisor look like. And everyone agreed. They had to be trusted by the girls. They had to be respected by the community. Some of the girls felt that a male advisor would have more influence and would actually help mediate their work and mediate their role with the communities. And so we didn't try to tell them, no, you have to pick a female advisor or a male advisor. This was, this came mostly from the girls themselves. And they really wanted someone who was a good listener. And so they talked among themselves repeatedly, and they didn't have a formal process, but they talked about the various people and different options and then came to their agreement. And then we honored that. They approached the people and asked if they were willing to serve in this role. and then our facilitators met with them if they accepted. And I have to say, it was really amazing to watch the initiative of both the girl mothers and of the community advisors. They understood very well that the girls were in the lead. The advisors understood very well that there were potential barriers at community level and that those needed to be addressed. So, for example, some advisors felt that the girls' suffering was not appreciated. There was kind of a misconception that it was only the community who had suffered. Girls were part of an armed group who were attacking people, so the idea was they had not suffered. So the girls actually did some role plays and dramas with community members present. And these role plays demonstrated how the girls had been abducted and the extreme fear and mistreatment that had often accompanied that. It demonstrated how difficult it was for the girls to be separated from their families and to not know where their loved ones were. And then there was, the fear associated with being inside an armed group, especially when you didn't want to be a member of that armed group, and there were ongoing attacks, assaults, and really deadly things happening. And these helped to raise awareness that the girls themselves had suffered and that many of them were not bad seed. They were girls, who lived in difficult settings, who had been recruited in ways that they had not wanted. And above all, it raised empathy. And I think it began a process of community members turning the corner and maybe remembering that these are our girls. These are not hardened killers. They're our girls. And that reframing is really a key part of helping the girls reconstruct their social identity from members of an armed group to being ordinary girls and community and moms and community members. The other thing that happened was that the community advisors went around with the girl mothers sometimes as they did their business and would introduce the girl mothers to other community members. And that really helped to set a positive tone, to reduce stigma, and to expand the networks of girl mothers. And then when community members saw that these girl mothers were really highly respectful and by virtue of their behavior demonstrated that, they wanted to put the past behind them and wanted very much, to humbly move forward and to build good relations. And then when people saw that they were working to earn money to be good mothers, this really changes the views of community people. So this was a process that was locally led. And it's not that outside experts had nothing to add. They did, particularly in changing the way that the NGOs worked and understood their role. But at every point, the success of the process stood on the shoulders of the girls, the community advisors, and the community members. And I'm happy to say that this more participatory approach to reintegration is becoming more widespread now. And as a matter of fact, as you probably know, there are some recently developed guidelines that I was an advisor on that were led by Plan International with the aid of Sandra Manyan and also by UNICEF. And so I think that, this kind of process has helped people learn that we really don't understand very well what are the child protection issues for children, how to do the reintegration through the eyes of girls in particular. And if you're going to help reintegrate girls, you can't just throw up, or erect a process for girls and boys that's the same. For these young women, nothing was more important than being a good mom. And I still don't know of a single reintegration program that has taken that into account. But it has to be taken into account if we are listening and if we're going to be successful. And, if you don't mind, at some point, Lucy, I'd like to bring this back into ordinary child protection.
Yeah, we can do that. I mean, I wanted to actually just say that some of the things you've said really reminded me of the case study that Glynis Clackerty talked to me about on this same podcast. She gave us the example of some work done in deep rural Tanzania, and it was a child-led child protection program. And what was really interesting, because I thought the way you describe what happened in the case study you've just talked about was really that it was quite strongly child-led in a way. You allowed these girls to lead.
I wholeheartedly agree that this process that I've described was child-led to begin with, but from the beginning, it was designed to enable support and action by the whole community. But we knew that we had to start with the girls themselves because they were suffering so badly, and they were completely excluded from the community, and nothing would change that until, we had enabled the girls to stand up on their own and to take these important steps of becoming good moms and, doing the things that community members would help see them in a transformed role. It's around the world, there's a lot of work on children's clubs and youth groups, and I think these are hugely important. Children and youth are actors. They're not just beneficiaries. They're more than victims. They have rising capacities, especially teenagers. I've known teenagers who are incredibly smart, creative, and even mature. And I think that oftentimes we underestimate what they can do. At the same time, of course, we have to be very careful. We don't want to double burden children with having to be the fixers of all their issues. But, in a community-led approach, part of the skill in implementing this kind of process is enabling a holistic, whole-of-community approach. So if I might, I'd like to try to describe the link between how it is that community-led child protection actually includes a peace-building lens. So the way I view it, based on decades now of experience and what communities have taught me, is that in the vast majority of communities, children, adolescents, and younger children are marginalized. And when you talk with the children, it won't take more than a few minutes of trust building and, getting to know each other that before people will bring this up, adolescents in particular. They feel they have no voice in what, happens. And oftentimes they're not viewed as agents. They're viewed as more or less people who should be seen, but not heard. And this is bad for one's mental health. One of the keys for psychosocial well-being and mental health is having a sense not only of voice, but of self-efficacy and agency. And in terms of community well-being and children's well-being overall, it's arguably only when the collective as a whole is attuned to the situation, the plight of children, and to wanting to ensure the well-being of all its children, that there can be well-being with social cohesion. So a good part of the community-led child protection process rests on early discussions around what are the harms to children, what are the issues that they face. And it's very interesting because initially in most communities, this would probably be true in my own community, adults would rush in and say, we know very well what are the issues. And they might identify some. They might say, well, gosh, there's bullying, there's substance abuse and drugs, there's early sex and teenage pregnancy and early marriage and all of these kinds of things. But it doesn't take long before young people to speak up and to begin saying things that adults had never heard about. And so we typically begin the community-led process with an open-ended qualitative process of learning that's based on the voices and lived experiences of girls and boys themselves. And we couple it with learning from adults, both women and men. But it's important to work in a gender-specific modality, because initially what people say is, we will learn about the harms to children by having large community meetings where everyone will talk. But a little bit of discussion discloses that children typically don't talk at big community meetings. That's not seen as their place. It would be seen as disrespectful. If the chief asks a girl to talk about what are the harms that girls face, she might not speak candidly, because maybe the perpetrator of sexual violence against her is present, and she's fearful about the repercussions for herself and her family. So there has to be a strategically designed process. And what we usually do is we ask communities, how could we learn from children in ways that they feel safe talking about harms to children, maybe with the proviso that they bring in a very general way their issues back to the community with no names and no finger pointing, no identification of who said what. And these are the ground rules that most communities evolve for themselves. And when that happens, the interesting thing that comes up is that communities become amazed at the breadth, severity, and variety of issues facing girls and boys in their communities. That means that there's been a lot of social injustice going on. There are not only these issues of violence against children, but the children themselves have been marginalized. So part of the process is using this social justice lens to bring them out of a position of marginality into a position where their voices make a difference and where their decisions, where they can participate in decision making. So in the next part of the process, there's typically a slow process of decision making about which harms to children do the communities want to take on. And again, there's a lot of discussion about who is the community. So communities have to decide, are we going to have big community meetings where we'll take a decision? And then usually with good facilitation, communities will realize, there are people who don't speak up. Children usually don't speak up at these big meetings. And there are people who don't participate. There may be a blind girl who doesn't come to meetings. There might be people who are extremely poor, who have to work extra jobs and extra hours, who can't come to the meetings. These are big social justice issues. So from a peace-building standpoint, you have to find ways of including and not doing it in a tokenistic way, but making it so that the poorest of the poor, the blind girl, the girls who have been abused, can have their voices heard in a way that's appropriate and non-threatening and ethically appropriate, and can then help communities roll up their sleeves and work on the issues. And within that, young people can be contributors to decision-making and action, but it does not rest all on their shoulders. I think it is a mistake to put too much on the shoulders of children. And from the standpoint of communities making decisions, there's lots of hand-wringing and doubts about communities. I've heard some people say, no, you can't leave it to communities because they'll decide to marry their daughters young as a means of protecting them. And it is true that in some societies, such as India and others, people have traditionally engaged in some harmful practices like marrying daughters young on the idea that you keep them marriageable that way and you reduce the chances that they will have been sexually active or made unmarriageable. But when you do these community dialogues, the ground rule, which the facilitator helps communities fulfill, is that there are many different views out there. none are right or wrong. Each needs to be said and listened to. And it's not a contest. No one's trying to impose their view. This is a very different process because often what happens in community discussions is the rich and wealthy, those who are better off, tend to hold sway. They define the problem, they define the solution, and everybody falls in behind them. Here, what we're doing is more transformative. It's moving children from a position of marginality so that they have a position of voice and some influence. And then communities are transformed because they begin seeing children's issues in a new way, and their caring gets galvanized. And as people begin discussing issues, they start talking about what's possible. And people begin sharing their ideas about options. And spontaneously, people begin disagreeing with traditional practices. So, for example, in India, some people came up with the idea that we want our daughters to stay in school. We don't want them dropping out and getting married. And, early marriage is harmful in a whole variety of ways. Girls drop out of school. Their mortality during childbirth is much higher. Girls don't understand how to be good wives, and that produces conflict and can fall back on them. And so there are a whole host of ways in which communities themselves surface the ways in which these processes like girl marriage are harmful. And so it's a process of debate and discussion. And out of these dialogues, communities decide on issues that they can agree on. And in every case that has been studied thus far, and there have really been quite a few because community-led child protection has been scaled up over the past few years in Sierra Leone, there have been no cases in which communities have taken on issues in which they are engaged in what some might call harmful traditional practices. In most cases, communities have debates about those, and so those don't rise to the level of agreement. But when they decide to address an issue, they try to do it on a whole community basis, and this is very hard to do. But oftentimes, girls and boys are key actors, and as are some key adults. Over time, as community members see successes, they then come in and become more active. The facilitation process involves constantly reaching out and engaging in dialogue with people who haven't been active, with an eye towards bringing them in, and then handing this function off to community members who are really quite animated and really enlivened by this process. And so over time, what you have is a process in which communities become not only more active at reducing violence against children, that's a peace-building benefit, but at the same time, they become more socially cohesive in recognizing the importance of children's well-being and in taking action to address it. And that social cohesion is a key part of peace-building. And I would say that social cohesion then loops back and helps communities move as one, acting in favor of the well-being of their children. So it's kind of a positive cycle, and it's bi-directional. The social justice peace-building lens helps strengthen child protection, and then the holistic community-led child protection strengthens social cohesion. So for me, these are inseparable. They are inextricably interlinked, even though the humanitarian and development worlds may view these as separate sectors.
Mike, that is an awful lot of food for thought that you've just told us about there. The things that stand out for me, okay, this is very progressive, very innovative. The idea that peace building is an integral part, really, of child protection, of community-led child protection, or indeed any kind of child protection. And I thought it was really interesting the way you describe a very deeply participatory process. And a lot of people might think, oh, we already do lots of participation. You know, we're doing the same thing. But it's not the same thing often, because participation is obviously a big part of it. But it's, like you've described, how you go in at the very beginning of this whole process, the mindset of the organization, the facilitators, these open-ended questions, this desire to just allow people to define what is important to them, is a very, very different approach than an organization that, let's say, wants to stop child marriage and goes in with that agenda and then says, do you all want to participate in our project? And we'll ask you about, you know, what you could do. And a lot of people, I guess, will say, yeah, sure, we'll be part of it. You know, maybe there's some benefit for them, or we don't really know what their motivation is. But it's a very different thing. And I think often people do think they're already doing a community-led process because there's high levels of participation. But what you've described, for me, highlights that it's not just about participation. It's about the mindset, also the assumptions that anyone who decides, or for any reason is working with a community, has about that community, that they assume from the outset that communities want to take good decisions for their children and for their collective well-being, actually, because nobody wants to live in a community where everybody is at odds with each other, or, you know, where there are bad things happening. So there's also that assumption that communities can and do want to do good for their children, which I think, if people were honest with themselves, often NGO workers and others make the opposite assumption, that the problem is the community. So those things really stood out for me. To finish, I always ask people to give me their key takeaways. So could you maybe give us a few key takeaways that you would like people to remember when they're in the field working with a community for child protection?
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. Well, chief among my takeaways is, first of all, that communities are resources. They are not just sites where we implement our program as outside experts. Communities can generate resources, problem solving, contextual approaches that we might miss. And as collectives, they already care about their children. But sometimes circumstances are really quite difficult and don't allow them to fulfill children's well-being. Give them a chance to think more carefully and in a more focused way about the well-being of their children. And my experience is that they will organize themselves to choose what are the main harms to children, how to address them. A second takeaway is that communities are resources, and they themselves are really good problem solvers. They do care about their children. They don't always get it right. But with a process of dialogue and reflection, it is possible for communities themselves to take direct action that supports the well-being of children and young people. And in that process, children and young people are oftentimes themselves key actors. This agency not only makes for highly contextual and holistic programs, but it creates ownership. Ownership translates into effectiveness and sustainability. And the agency felt by the young people and by the community people themselves, because they are making the decisions, contributes to their mental health and their psychosocial well-being. And then a third takeaway is that one cannot just do this project with good intentions. You have to go through a process of reflecting and of learning new habits, adopting a different orientation of listening and co-learning. You have to really create a lot of space for listening, dialogue, sharing power. And that means taking a much more reflexive approach than I would say is typical in the humanitarian and development arenas. But when one does this, the payoffs are great. The effectiveness is higher. the sustainability is fundamentally greater. And the longevity, the energy, the resilience, the collective action felt by communities is absolutely astonishing. I haven't really talked about this, but one of the findings from Kenya and Sierra Leone, and to an increasing extent in India, is that villages share this word of mouth with others. Other villages say, hey, we've learned that some very special things are happening for girls and that they're not getting married young, or that the sexual abuse and sexual violence against girls is decreasing. We have those problems too. Can you help us? Will you share what you're doing? So this means that communities themselves are eager for this approach. And so I guess I would leave us with a question. Are we ready to rise to meeting that need and helping communities become very effective collectives working with and on behalf of the well-being of their children? Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike. Well, thanks for leaving us with that challenge. I think part of this podcast is to help people really think through how they do their work. And this whole series hopefully can give people a bit of inspiration as to how they might approach things differently as practitioners, or even within their organizations or organizations as a whole. So thanks so much, Mike. It's appreciated. I learned a lot. There's a lot to think about. I know you've shared the papers with me, and just to let everyone know, at the end of this podcast, I'll give you the address where you'll be able to access those papers and quite a bit of the information that Mike has mentioned today. So again, Mike, a really big thank you to you. If you'd like to read any of the reports or papers mentioned in this episode, you can go to childprotectionforum.org, go to the podcasts tab, and click on the relevant episode to see all the links. Alternatively, you can go to the Community Child Protection Exchange's YouTube channel, where you'll find all the links underneath each episode. This podcast was made possible thanks to the Child Resilience Alliance with a grant from Oak Foundation. It was produced and hosted by myself, Lucy Hillier of the Community Child Protection Exchange. Original music was composed and performed by Jay Bones. Thanks, and see you next time.